That was hard to read. And when she began compartmentalizing her emotions and hiding how she really felt. And for me personally, having experience with alcoholism, that's when I really started drinking, was when I started hiding things, and felt like I had secrets. I certainly wasn't going to tell anybody in the church about them.
Welcome to Amy Liz Harrison's podcast, Eternally Amy, a mum of eight's journey from jail to joy. A Gen Xer who overcame her struggle with alcohol to become a best-selling author and mental health advocate. She shares stories of hope and offers ideas for others struggling with mental health challenges, spirituality, ADHD, or maybe just family, travel, and logistics. One thing is for sure, you'll leave with something to chew on. And now, here's your host, Amy Liz Harrison, with your mystery meat sandwich.
Greetings, compadres. Another episode of the Boozless Book Club. Yay! Okay, so instead of the mystery meat sandwich, we're going to just dive in. We're going to just dive into the chaplain's chat, meaning it's time to stretch out the Speedo. Get a little baby oil on your shoulders. I just watched the Richard Simmons documentary last night, so I have baby oil on the brain. So anyways.
Wait, where is that documentary? Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, it's on Hulu now.
Okay, Hulu. Good to know. Thank you.
Yep. And they tell you everything about what happened to him, why he's been in hiding and all of this. So you'll have to watch it. So today I have with me three of my lovely lady friends, entrepreneurs, czars of sobriety, if you will. And I decided I'm going to give you ladies a name. I didn't tell you this. So hi, surprise. And it's going to be the Boozless Babes, which, you got to be a little careful with, not to be confused with the Boozeless Boobs. So Boozless Babes. So in no particular order, we have Alysse Bryson. She is the CEO and founder of The Sober Curator and fellow 80s superfan. We also have Carolyn Bunn, who is a marketing expert and a travel blogger, and also the business manager of yours truly, which is a huge job, not because my business is big, but because my brain doesn't work very well. So she spends most of her time handling that. And finally, Sarah Alaimo, who is a happiness career coach and just celebrated the 1-year anniversary of her memoir called Pearls and Probation. And she is here with us today, and she is back from having her baby. Oh my goodness. And the best news is he's here. So that's really exciting. So if you hear any little, baby noises, that's him. I'm so excited to have you guys here. And what we're going to do is we're going to start off with Carolyn's going to give kind of a summary of the book. So we just read Refocusing My Family by Amber Cantorna. Am I saying that right? Cantorna?
I think so. I was going to say the same thing. So Amber, if you end up listening to this, we hope you do. Yeah. I hope we're saying your name right.
I hope so.
That's the way I said it.
Okay, great. So Carolyn, take it away.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm just going to read a little blurb. This is the first one that I found on the internet. So, but I think it gives a good summary of the book. So in her book, Refocusing My Family, Coming Out, Being Cast Out, and Discovering the True Love of God, Amber recalls a happy childhood in a family that outwardly seemed perfect. But a dark side emerged as she struggled under the weight of perfectionism, reputation, and appearances. Amber tells of her journey of self-discovery and exposes the dark truth of how the values of focus on the family tore her family apart. Ultimately, her struggle was transformed into freedom when she boldly stepped into her identity and discovered that the true love of God surpasses all. So just to give a kind of a more of a summary of that, Amber is the daughter of a Focus on the Family executive. And so for those who don't know, Focus on the Family, and feel free for anybody else to jump in on with me, but I was raised a lot with a lot of Focus on the Family. It was founded by Dr. James Dobson. And it is, I don't know if we would call it fundamentalist Christian or evangelical or how we would describe it. But a lot of it is books surrounded by Christian values, but a lot of it, especially in the 90s, I don't know how it is now, was not friendly to the LGBTQ community. And so basically their thought behind this was if you can't be a family if you are homosexual. And it was very against that. And Amber identifies as homosexual. And so her growing up in this community and never feeling like she had could understand her true identity. And then it talks about how eventually her family basically disowned her for her identification with being a lesbian, and how she found hope after that with her own friends and family that she found, not blood family, but her own that she found on her own. So that's kind of to give you a more of a summary than that. And for those that are listening that maybe have not read the book.
Thank you so much. That was super complete and that was perfect. And I don't want to assume anything here, but I think that everybody in the Boozless Babes here has had some previous church connection at some level. So maybe not focus on the family per se, but did you relate to any parts of Amber's upbringing specifically? And if so, how? And that's like part A of my first question. And part B is, of course, going to be purity culture for those of us who grew up in the evangelical 90s Christian scene. So we'll talk a little bit about Modest is Hottest for those of you who were part of that. So the first thing I just wanted to kind of throw out there was I was really taken by the quote in the foreword. So I loved this book. I have to say, I loved it. I mean, scale of 1 to 10. For me, it was like a 9.5. I don't even know why I wouldn't say 10, maybe because some people would be like, well, nothing's either a full 1 or 10. But I loved it. And I loved it so much because I felt like I identified with Amber on my own, in my own journey. So yeah. Let me just start with, I'm gonna read you guys this quote from the foreword. So this is a quote by somebody named Susan Cottrell, who she wrote the foreword for Amber. She's the founder and president of something called Freed Hearts, which I thought was great. So Susan says, we were shocked that the verses that are said to condemn homosexuality aren't even talking about homosexuality as we know it. Those verses relate more to the priest sex scandal and sex trafficking than to adult relationships of mutual consent. And then she says, how ironic that a ministry that claims to focus on the family instead focuses on reputation, rules, and being right. And that to me was something that I could relate to, is that last part of that quote particularly, is the whole idea that I personally gathered from the church growing up was that they knew what to do. They being the church. Okay, it's just a nebulous term for the church that I'm using. And this is, by the way, just my perception of what I thought I was understanding at the time. I'm not saying like my church definitely taught this, but for me, that was the big deal was that, my church had the answers for life. It had the answers for you, for me, for everybody else. And it was a one size fits all. And you're either going to sign on the bottom line, so to speak, and accept Jesus as your savior and get baptized and, go through the membership class. And this is how we do it. And if you don't do it, you're not really a Christian, or maybe you're like a Christian like minus, like maybe a D minus or a C minus. And so I really, I identified with everything she was talking about in terms of the mentalities and the viewpoints.
Well, I will say, Amy, I also love this book. And I was actually, if anybody else didn't like it, you can blame me because I was the one that kind of had heard about it. And I feel like I identified with it a lot. I was parts of it, other than I don't identify with the LGBTQ community. I am an ally, but other than that, I grew up as a homeschooled person, went to church twice a week, did home, the going on Sundays, going to youth group on Wednesdays, and absolutely the purity culture that was so prevalent back then. And it also brought a lot of nostalgia in terms of like that she loved Anne of Green Gables and there was American Girl dolls. And I was like, oh my gosh, I remember all of this from being a kid. But yeah, I also feel the same way in terms of I think that as a kid, you're right, Amy. I felt like it was a lot of like this grading, and if you will, like everybody else out there is wrong, but we are right. We have all the answers right here. You don't have to go anywhere else. And I always felt like, when I got older as an adult, the fears that were instilled in me that people were going to try to pull me away from my faith and do all this, and it never really came to fruition the way that I was told that I should have a fear of that. And in general, I always felt like other people have been way more accepting in terms of, oh, you're Christian, that's great. That's your faith. If you are an atheist, okay, well, that's what I believe. That's, what you believe. But I always felt like, yeah, it was a lot of fear instilled in terms of like everybody else is wrong, but we are right. So I definitely related a lot to it.
How about Sarah or Alysse?
But look at how cute that baby is. Look at how cute that Boozless baby is.
He read the book with me all the way through. But yes, no, I definitely related to her upbringing, going to a very similar type church. I didn't have the exact same upbringing. My father was not a part of the faith, so that was probably the main difference. But I could totally relate to, kind of the word that just popped into my head, and I feel bad saying this, was but like the brainwashing of how we need to be and how you can receive love, how you can be, in faith. I definitely understand all of those, and 100% the purity culture. I mean, I signed a lifestyle expectation agreement when I went to college. So, I chose to continue that path within the strict faith. And I think it took me a long time to kind of break some of those cycles, but 100% can relate. I loved the picture in her book of the American Girl birthday party. I was thinking I wanted to pull those dolls out. I have those too, still do.
I loved, just a side note, Sarah, like you said, I loved all the pictures in this book. I think it was so cool that she added a lot of photos to kind of give the reader an idea of what it was like.
You really identify to those dresses and the style.
Oh, yeah.
Well, and the one picture of her bangs, with the curled bangs that were like, did the split where it curled half down and then the half up. You guys,
oh yeah,
you did that.
Easy to do.
Totally.
For me, as soon as I think of Focus on the Family, I have an immediate memory of going with my mom when I was little to like a big Focus on the Family conference. I know it was in a stadium. I feel like my memory is putting it in Spokane because that's where my mom was from. So we would go there a lot. But I guess it could have been over here, on this side of the mountains in Washington too. And for whatever reason, I just remember not wanting to sit in my seat and kept wanting to go to the snack area to buy more snacks. I don't know. That's what comes up for me in this one. It's what I just think of Focus on the Family. But the purity culture and we know the right way and that it's only this way. Yes, I also identify with that. Both my grandfathers were pastors. Nazarene pastors. So if you're familiar with Nazarene church chain,
Okay.
or fellowship or whatever you
Like
want
it's
to
a
call it.
McDonald's. Sorry.
Right. Exactly. Whoops. But and I went to a private Christian school and my mom was the teacher. And so I was literally at the church 6 to 7 days a week, like 10 hours a day, like basically, whether it was a church or caravans or school or after school. However, I don't personally identify as LGBTQ. I am also a supporter and have many friends in that community. And I don't have an experience with it directly growing up or even being aware of it growing up. I was incredibly sheltered. Like we weren't even allowed to watch movies that were over a PG rating. And so I don't even know if I would have known what queer or bisexual or I don't think I had any level of awareness of it until I'm not even sure I had it in high school. If I'm just being honest, like I'm like very sheltered. But I understand. But the way that I looked at it was, I understood the purity, right? And what Sarah was talking about, the contract and being pure and saving myself for my husband. And it was like I was just told all the things that I couldn't do, which of course made me just want to go do them all, like to be clear. And I did, and then some. But I hate the double standards of religion, but it doesn't mean that I think that Christianity is bad. I actually don't at all. I just think that people need to realize too, I just give us some grace. Like just because you're in a church and you're the head of Focus on the Family, you're still human, right? So humans are all going to make their mistakes and they're just working with whatever tools they have. So for me, what came up was giving a little bit of grace on both sides, even though like her stories were hard. Like some of those were really hard to read, right? I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it totally made sense. And I'm just curious how many of you guys did sign either a purity pledge like Amber or a lifestyle contract like Sarah. Did you guys both ever at a point in your life, Alysse and Carolyn?
I didn't have that, but I do remember. So I feel like, and Alysse, I wanted to say, I relate, before I say that, I feel like I relate a lot to what you just said because I was also like homeschooled, right? And then you're at church, and I never had that experience of like outside people. I was always actually afraid to go to public school because I felt like that was such a different world and that I was not exposed to. And so, feeling a little bit like siloed in that, I totally understand that. But to answer your question, so I felt like a lot of things that happened to me when I was a kid were just kind of like, we're going to do this and this is what it is. So my parents bought me a purity ring when I was like 15 as a birthday gift, but there was no discussion around it. It wasn't like, here's why it's important. It was just like, here's your purity ring. Happy birthday. And I was like, I don't think I made this decision. I also felt kind of the same way about like abortion too. Even at a young age, I was kind of like, wait, we don't believe in this, and why? And why is it my dad the one that's the most passionate about this, but he's a dude? Some of those things just didn't make sense to me, but it was like decisions that my parents had already made up for us, and there was no like discussion behind it. So yeah, I never signed anything, but I did have a purity ring given to me just on the assumption that I understood what that was.
The expectation, right? Here you go.
Yeah.
I have something that's coming up for me, and I hope it's not off topic, but I can remember, so I went from private Christian school to public high school, right? 9th through 12th grade. So my freshman year, I stayed with the church kids, did not deviate from the church kids, if I didn't know you from church, I didn't need to know you. I was scared of you probably, right? But my sophomore year, I started branching out because I realized there were a lot of cool kids that I wanted to be friends with, and they were not the church kids, right? And I can remember staying the night at a girl's house for a slumber party. And looking back now, I didn't know how to describe her family, but words I might use now would be very alternative compared to my lifestyle. Like it was just like I felt like I had walked into another world, but they were also really nice. So I was confused because I thought anyone who didn't believe like we did was bad, right? So it was very confusing to me. And I remember that they put on Rocky Horror Picture Show. And I was just like, I mean, I think that might have even been my first exposure to anything that was so like I was that sheltered. And I just remember being like the whole time, like deer in headlights, like not understanding what was going on, still wanting to be cool and act like I knew what was going on. So too scared to ask questions, didn't want to talk about it. You know, like I just, you know, I don't know how I handled myself in the situation. I remember I was still friends with those girls, so I must have handled it fine. But that's a very distinct memory for me. It was so jarring and I didn't know what to do.
Yeah. I know that for me, the whole idea that my church knew the answers also meant that even though out of one side of their mouth, it sounded like they were saying to love and include everybody. And by the way, I am also an ally. Although I don't, I identify as heterosexual female. I don't know why it was that it felt like the other side of their mouth, the church's mouth, was like, oh, well, let's see, Mormons and all these different denominations, like P.S. Nazarenes. When I was growing up in my denomination, they said that you could lose your salvation. That was the big deal. So you had to be careful, quote unquote, if you went to Point Loma. That was the big thing. But I actually just bring that up because of how ridiculous that sounds to me right now to say out loud. Like it sounds ridiculous to me because my denomination tended to be like, well, we kind of have it figured out. And I'm sorry, but that's kind of a veiled like pat on the back. You know what I mean? Like, I'm going to try and pretend like this is not arrogant or has any ego in it, but it was like full of ego now that I look back on it, and just how much I couldn't even understand why I believed the things that I believed because I just took them at face value. And Amber definitely talks a lot about that too. And one thing that I love that she said in regards to this whole purity thing, she said on page 33 that the purity culture wraps your entire identity up in your purity and virginity. So for many, this has caused great harm in their romantic relationships as they entered adulthood, causing them to get married before they should in order to stay chaste. And like, yeah, I don't know how many times I saw that in college, the Christian race to the altar. So that they could have sex. And, I don't know if the statistic is still true, but at that time in the late 90s, well, it was, mid 90s, the statistic back then was that 50% of Christian marriages were ending in divorce and 50% of quote unquote secular marriages were ending in divorce. So there really was no difference. And to me, it seems like, oh, well, here's a good idea. Like, we're babies, essentially. Like, we're 17, 18, maybe 19 years old. Like, here's a good idea. Let's go get married. Like, get married so that we can have sex. It just like, to me, it's just like mind blowing that this was encouraged. I guess maybe now that I have kids those ages, I can't imagine saying, yeah, that's a great idea, guys. Good luck. You're going to pay your bills and you guys are going to get jobs and, be adulting and pay taxes, all this stuff. And never mind the relationship, but just so you can have sex.
You guys remember ever hearing, like, I remember in college, there was the whole ring by spring thing. Like, I do know people who have admitted to getting married just so they could have sex. And then they got divorced.
I remember you talking about that in your book, Sarah. Yeah.
Well, and I had kind of my own personal experience was, yes, I was also told you don't have sex until you're married. Nothing else was explained to me. Nothing. So then then when I found myself in situations, especially when you added alcohol and drugs into the equation, I didn't know, like, then I took it very literal. Like, I guess I can do everything else but this, which was pretty damaging, right? And then when I ultimately lost my virginity, not by choice at a young age, in my mind, I was no longer pure. So then I was immediately garbage, right? So then it didn't matter if I let people treat me like garbage because that's what I already thought I was, right? So it had a really, really terrible outcome for me. Like it was. I mean, to a certain extent, there's still some of those old tapes that will rattle around in the back of my head all these years later, right? I still have problems with intimacy and being in relationships. So the purity route, that it's this way or no way, is incredibly damaging.
And the whole concept, thanks for sharing that, Alysse, because the whole concept of if you lose your virginity and you lose that purity, I mean, that was like looked upon with such shame. It was like, oh, then you're this used up piece of gum. There were all these terrible metaphors. And a lot of them had to do with, at least this was my experience, was, women, particularly females, were the ones, who were sort of more shunned for this because they were also the ones, of course, who were in charge of, quote unquote, if you're listening and not watching, but the male's purity or causing them to, quote, stumble, unquote. So you had to make sure that there were high necklines, no midriffs. I remember countless times going to camps and it was like no two-piece swimsuits, one piece only, hashtag modest is hottest. You're welcome. But all of that stuff. And this may be actually like, this is a whole other podcast episode, but I struggle with that today. I struggle with that today because of an institution that my kids are a part of. And it's just tough because some of those old school viewpoints are still there. And so we talk a lot about that. My girls and I do, because it's damaging. It's damaging to send that kind of messaging to girls, in my opinion, that they are solely responsible for the spiritual outcome of boys. I don't know.
Yeah, I agree. And I'll just add to that I think especially, the clothing, I remember that, Amy, of like, you can't wear a two-piece, but like you can't wear shorts that are too short or a tank top with the spaghetti straps. And it being so hard as a kid to shop. Like I have long legs, but the shorts were always too short. And it was like, what are we supposed to, what department are we supposed to shop? And it was so confusing and just feeling like there was so much around that was so important,
Well, and I don't know if you all had this experience, but I have several different memories. Like there were so many, like, yes, it was put on the women. And as I just mentioned, like, I didn't even know, I wasn't even aware of the LGBT community when I was a kid. Like it didn't even exist. Right. But then why, I mean, almost everybody I know who grew up in the church knows of countless white males who took advantage of situations and somehow they were just forgiven and that was okay. But the rest of it was unforgivable. It was very confusing.
Yeah. I think because that is, such a theme, right, in many of our lives that we have seen over and over again, which is such an interesting, like, we're still doing this. We're still causing this damage. I wonder, why this is perpetuated by an institution that is supposed to be talking about, loving your neighbor as yourself. And I just find it's got some cognitive dissonance for me even now that is, I'm still working through, really, to be totally honest. And I don't know, it makes me think about too, all of those authors like Joshua Harris in I Kiss Dating Goodbye. That was a big book in the 90s. And it was basically, he came forward and was saying, hey, only date unless you are intending to possibly marry this person. And he has since come forward and said he basically is like refuting all of that messaging. And he himself is now divorced and has kind of taken back all the stuff that he said. And I just think that is so admirable because it takes a lot. It takes a lot, I think, to say, hey, I don't subscribe to that anymore. And I realized that I harmed a lot of people in the process of all that. But
yeah, I loved Amy talking about Joshua Harris, that documentary that he had on YouTube, I think it was. I don't know if anybody else saw that, but talking about purity culture, and he actually interviews people and gets feedback from people who had read the book. I'll put it in the show notes, the link to that. But I found it to be really fascinating to kind of just reflect back on that purity culture and to realize that at the time he was only 21 years old when he wrote that book, as if he had all this experience with dating. And now I look back and I go, I didn't know anything at 21. So
literally nothing. Literally nothing.
Nobody really knows anything at 21. Let's be honest. But not anything, but we're limited when it comes to that, I will say for sure. So I thought that was really interesting.
That was a great documentary. I don't remember specifics, but I remember that there were some people that he had harmed and they were like, I don't forgive you. And I was so impressed by his willingness to sit there and just listen and take that in and hold space for those people. I just thought that was so powerful that he was allowing them to experience being in front of somebody who, in their words, had, really profoundly altered the course of their life and not for the better. And he was able to sit there and just, with grace, just let them share and talk and just say, I'm sorry. And I know I can't heal this for you. And that's terrible. And I loved it. I had a lot of respect for him. I thought that was big. And then the other thing I just wanted to know is if anybody else wrote a letter to their future husband, like I did multiple times.
Oh, I'm pretty sure I did. Yeah, I'm pretty sure.
I was ever prompted, but I'm sure I did. I don't have it anymore.
I don't think I did, but I loved that Amber included that in her book as another picture. And I thought it was hilarious when she talked about how, I think, did she say he had to like sports or something like that? Yeah. She's like, I don't even like sports, but he has to like
everybody
sports.
else is saying. I did make that list though. And this was a little bit later in life, the list of the things that my husband needed to be.
Oh yeah, I carried it around in my wallet.
Mine was prompted by a counselor later in life.
As if I'm just gonna pull it out at the bar, like how many of these do you check? Yeah.
Right.
My husband is 27 of the 30. I still have it.
We should have come up with an app, where we could have listed the characteristics like a checklist, and then, it would sync up with his phone and like, I don't know. We could have made it something like a Tinder for conservative Christians, or I don't know.
Isn't that like Go? Isn't there one like that? Go Fish or?
Oh my gosh, yeah, I remember it.
Plenty of Fish? No,
yeah,
that's
right.
Not it. That's Plenty of Fish. No, I don't know.
I've literally used every app that there is. I did not meet my husband on an app.
No, I didn't either, but I've heard it happens. I don't know.
I know my sister met her husband on OkCupid.
All right.
Yep.
Carolyn is a Bumble story, right?
Your Bumble? Mm-hmm.
I like it. It does work. It does work sometimes. Okay, so then I thought it was very brave of Amber to share about the molestation she experienced as a child and the resulting conversation that she had with her mom, and how she didn't know it at the time, but that was PTSD. And then she was later diagnosed with it, and that her mom kind of just wrote it off and sort of said, well, a lot of kids experiment, a lot of people, are curious. And that was, I thought, pretty, I thought that was hard to read. And she said something about, paraphrasing, that her mom didn't validate her pain, but she downplayed it and taught her that it wasn't safe to share the deepest parts of her heart with her own mom. And that was just, yeah, that was hard to read. And when she began compartmentalizing her emotions and hiding how she really felt. And for me personally, having experience with alcoholism, that's when I really started drinking, was when I started hiding things, and felt like I had secrets. I certainly wasn't going to tell anybody in the church about them because I would be judged. I would be put in the, not fit for Bible study leadership group. You know what I mean? Like I would be put in a space that I didn't want to be in. And so as a result, it's a very lonely, alienating place to be because you kind of feel like you can't really share with anybody. I don't know if any of you had this experience, but like I remember being in Bible study groups during prayer time. Hey, does anybody have anything they need prayer for? And of course it was like, yes, my grandma, fell off of her footstool. And yes, my dad's cat is having surgery. And not that those things aren't important, but no one ever shared in my spaces where I was. Nobody ever shared what was really going on with them. It was all like, yeah, we've got a prayer list and it's for everybody else. And sometimes it's also a way for us to gossip about other people in the church. Please pray for Betsy because this is the third night she hasn't slept at her house with her husband. Like,
Yeah. I love that you pointed that out, Amy, because it does bring me back to those times of like these, I don't want to say superficial prayer requests, but I don't also feel like mental health was a top priority. And in terms of being able to say, hey, I'm really struggling with this. I'm having a hard time emotionally with something. And I just absolutely felt for her hearing her story about that. And can't relate in that specific way, but I do relate in a way of remembering that there was a lot of hush hush. Like we don't talk about that kind of stuff. Like that's too serious. If somebody's having surgery, we'll do a prayer request for that. But if you are experiencing an issue with another person within the church and they're doing something to you, like keep it on the down low. We don't want to hear about that. And so some things that were too serious. And yeah, I think being that fear of not being able to talk about things definitely manifests itself in different ways for different people. I know it did for myself, not in that extreme of a way, but just feeling fear that you can't come to the people who you respect and ask them a question without feeling judged or feeling like you're a bad person or getting a reaction out of them for asking a question or feeling uncomfortable or saying something that needs to be said.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for bringing that up, because I loved when Amber was talking about expressing emotions and stifling intuition. It was like, yeah, I remember that was definitely something that was being taught, or at least I perceived it was being taught in my church, was, be happy all the time and be ready when somebody asks you all the time why, you're super like exuberant and happy. And it's because, you have Jesus Christ. And so as long as you have Jesus Christ, you need to kind of look this way and you need to uphold the appearances as follows. Almost like, like being in a sorority. I had a friend who was in a sorority. She couldn't leave the sorority house without having her hair curled. And it was kind of that same mentality of like, well, you represent this. And so therefore you look like this. And so I loved how page 10, Amber said that as a result, she grew up believing that a normal life meant a happy life without conflict. As I grew, I noticed even more that strong emotions, especially negative ones, weren't welcome. And I thought that was interesting. Now that we're talking, we've kind of moved on to the mental health piece. Did you guys have any experiences like that in your upbringings?
I just wondered what was so wrong with me that I, wasn't always the happy version that I was putting out there, that there were things that bothered me, that there were things I didn't understand. Like, there's got to be something wrong with me because everyone else is fine. Clearly, everyone else is understanding how to handle the world. And yeah, I definitely, not that I had the same experience she did, but, the times that I would go to my mom to ask a question about something, I didn't get answers. I didn't feel like I had anyone to really go to. I couldn't talk to anyone at church or friends. Didn't want to be shamed. I didn't want to be different. I didn't want anyone to know.
Mm-hmm.
As an example of not necessarily always have to be happy, but I do remember a very specific time when I was very young that my great aunt's son had a mental disability, and I was about, I think, 8 or maybe 9 or 10 years old, and I knew that he was different. And we were staying with her, and my grandma was there, and I knew that he was different, and I wasn't asking in a derogatory way or of any type, but I asked my grandma, I said, what's different about him? Or said, why is he different? Kind of something like that. And I just remember she said, oh no, we don't ever ask that. Don't ever bring that up again. And so it really instilled this fear in me to not ask questions about the world around me. Like, it is the way it is. We don't talk about mental health. We don't talk about people with disabilities or anything like that. And that is bad. And so to not be curious about the world with that stigma that you're a bad person for asking questions, even if they're innocent.
The example that I was thinking of when I said that was during the time that Magic Johnson was talking about being, HIV positive. So I asked my mom, what does that mean to practice safe sex? And her response was just, oh, no, you're too young. We don't talk about those kind of things. And so we never, ever talked about sex.
Mm-hmm.
I don't even know who gave me the talk, probably friends or TV shows. I don't know.
Yeah. So the only message is don't do it.
There's so
healthy.
Yeah. Just don't do it. That's the only message.
Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like the overarching, though, kind of the other side of this is where the author gets to her family by choice, right? That resonated with me because you do have your family, right? But then you have your family by choice, people that are in your life that become much closer than just an acquaintance or just a friend, that they become people, that accept you for truly who you truly are without judgment.
And, accepting people without judgment. I mean, I didn't have experience like that until I started prioritizing my mental health and went through my journey. And even when Amber went to therapy for the first time, and this is just, I just bring this up because I just think this is such an important distinction to make too, is that, she talks about the first therapist that she went to wasn't a real therapist, right? It was like a lay counselor in the church, which is super common. That, maybe you're going to meet with a pastor, or maybe you're going to meet with, somebody on staff at the church. And not that there's anything wrong with doing that, right? But there's a difference between going to get professional help, right? And having somebody in the church speak into your life and then share maybe what you shared with others. And there being no sense of, having a confidence that your process wasn't going to go any further than who you confided in. And that's just tough. That was tough. And so I loved later when she mentioned that her first therapist that she went to, who was a professional therapist, wasn't, she was non-judgmental. And it was like, that's just a huge difference. It's just huge, to be able to have somebody who will validate you in your journey and your process and meet you where you are.
So are you talking about her person that she took piano lessons with, that she was kind of confiding in. If I remember, it's been like a month since I read the book. But,
Right. Okay. So I think that was, that was like kind of one of the catalysts, right? Because then she goes into that whole story and the emotional abandonment piece and how difficult that was. And I related to all of that too.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think I just wanted to kind of just point out the differences in the therapist and to make that distinction, because I know for me, when I started feeling similar to what Sarah described, kind of like, why is everybody else happy and I'm unhappy inside? And I started feeling like there was something wrong with me, when the reality was, this is a normal teenage experience, highs, lows, ups, downs, hormones, blah, blah, blah. And I literally thought, like, I was comparing my insides to everybody else's outsides, as they say. And I really felt like there is definitely something off here. And so, I got sent to do a cleansing stream. I don't know if anybody's done cleansing stream, but, a lot of, there were a lot of kind of like buds that started popping up in the flower garden of the church that were like these additional ministries that you could go to if you needed some healing or some whatever, work through some baggage. And they were, they were not professional programs. They were just folks who developed a class and were selling it and didn't have personal experiences in some cases even with it, just thought that they were going to kind of give you some scriptures and send you on your way.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that. I mean, I kind of remember, and I felt bad for her in that book, because when she had a piano teacher and she was confiding in her a lot. And I can understand from that piano teacher's point of view as well, maybe it just got to be too overwhelming to be that middle person, and to never, I think the moral is like you said, Amy, professional help is so important, and somebody that's trained to deal with that, and not just somebody that's going to give you Bible verses and send you on your way. Because I definitely felt like that sometimes growing up in a church. You go to somebody and say, I'm struggling with this thing. And they're like, here's some, and they're just not prepared. They're not prepared to deal with that, right, in a professional way. And to never underestimate the value of a true person that's like a professional counselor or therapist.
Yeah. Yeah. She said on page 122, Amber said, the new therapist let me bring all parts of myself to the table: my faith, my family, my sexuality, my questions. There weren't any limitations when it came to her office. I just thought that was so beautiful. Because, I saw a counselor myself at when I was in college, and I remember just kind of sitting there going, okay, so how do I do this? Here's my stuff. Can you just tell me how I solve this, this, and this? And really what I was looking for at that point, now in hindsight, looking back, I was looking for identification. Like for somebody to go, yeah, I get what you're saying. That's valid. Or, maybe if they didn't even get it on a personal level, like that makes complete sense that, a lot of people go through this, or, that there are things that we all struggle with. And they just manifest themselves sometimes in different ways. And I just felt like, I was kind of broken, that I had somehow, somewhere along the way, broken myself, and, that I was trying to kind of get myself back and get happier, and kind of didn't get there. And so when Amber starts talking about the hair pulling and the anxiety, and, I really related on my own level to that feeling of like, she mentions that one day her dad said to her, why don't you just stop? Like, just stop, And I often felt like for me that I was like a little bit too much, that I was constantly grabbing like, another, like a roommate at college and like trying to process something or whatever. and, that people were just like, you're a little much. Like, I don't know. So yeah, did anybody else relate to the trauma piece, anxiety piece, counseling piece, maybe?
Most definitely. Just when you were talking about the just stop, that's exactly what my family said to me with drinking. You just stop. And I didn't have the words for it. And I don't think I ever was able to show up at the table as my full self until coming into recovery, until getting into this 12-step program.
You got anything else you want to add to that one, Alysse?
I do have a memory coming up, and it's a memory. I mean, it's accurate. It's just my memory. I have learned that sometimes my memory is not what actually happened. Pretty sure this is after I'd had my son. I had my son when I was 21, pretty young. And I was back living with my parents, and for about a year after he was born, I was not drinking or using any drugs, but that was a very finite window of time before I turned it all down. But during that time, they had concerns about things that had happened in high school and college before I dropped out, that they sent me to a therapist who gave me, I remember it was a test. It was like a 1 or a 2 hour test. And I think that my memory has it that I answered all the questions correctly. And the results came back that if that was accurate, that I needed to be in a mental institution. I needed to be locked up. And of course, the reaction was, that's just the devil. And that's obviously not right. So let's just act like that didn't happen. Let's just put that test away. Now, my mom may have a totally different memory of that, right? But it's just more to go to the culture back in the 80s and the 90s, and obviously before, was that we just don't talk about it. We just don't talk about it. So what I am glad is that it's not the 90s anymore, although I do love the 90s and 90s music and 90s decor. But, that even now there's still so much stigma in the world, but there's more people talking about things. And that's what this book does. It gets people talking.
I love too when she was talking about, so, and you mentioned, Alysse, like family of choice. And so, we go through the big, coming out where Amber tells her parents that she's gay. And that was just such a hard chapter for me to read. She was just very descriptive, and you could just feel it. I could anyway. And I just remember just feeling like so awkward for her, at that point in time. She's, doing amazing and great now, but just those moments where, she's talking about basically like all my fears came true. And just how hard that would be, how difficult. And so then she's moving on to try and find a new church or find somewhere else to go or make sense of her spirituality at that time. And kind of like, where do I go from here? And I was just wondering if that also brought up any emotions for you guys reading through that chapter about when she was coming out.
I think for me, I feel very fortunate that I have a relationship with my parents. Even though I don't agree with every single thing, we don't have the same exact beliefs, but I just thought I felt the same way as just hearing like that chapter. I just couldn't put the book down, but I also it was such a heart-wrenching chapter. And I don't want to get too descriptive because people want to read the book. It's so well written that I don't want to take away from that. But just the way that her father reacted to that, and to feel like that your parents are basically saying, we don't want any part of this anymore, or of you, it just sounded really heartbreaking.
Yeah, I just kept thinking as I was reading her parents' responses, where is the love? Like this isn't Christianity.
Mm.
It was just so heartbreaking. I could feel it, because I mean, on a certain level, I've definitely experienced that, kind of shame from my parents. They weren't expecting their daughter to do a lot of the things I have in life, but never to that extent. And I'm just very grateful, like Carolyn was saying, that I still have a good relationship with them.
That's awesome.
Amy, there was a part, it was actually, you read that out of the forward at the beginning of this episode. And now that we're near the end, I'm going to read out of the end of the forward because this paragraph specifically really stood out to me. Again, this is written by Susan Cortrell, a founder and president of Freed Hearts. She wrote the forward. Mr. Whitaker said in an Odyssey episode, God puts those passions in our heart for a reason. God put passions in Amber's heart for a reason too. I imagine if Whit could read her story, he might shake his head and say, Jesus wants us to focus on love, not being right, coming together, not breaking apart. I also imagine that he'd like the story has a happy end.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much for reading that because, as difficult as some of the parts were to read, it was like, I know where this was going. You know what I mean? I knew that she had found happiness and freedom. And I've been watching her a little bit recently on YouTube, and it's clear that she is in a space after all of the fallout from all of this and all of the pain and the, rejection and all of the shame and, that she's now in a space where she's like, yeah, I went through all of that and I wish it looked different on the other side. As in like, I wish things had been healed with my parents in the way that I wanted, but it's not the case. And I'm now okay because I've set up boundaries. And I thought that was just so poignant too, that she knew that she had to protect herself and care for herself, so that she didn't further subject herself to more of that pain from her folks. And then to have that family of choice, to have, a couple who was affirming stand with her at her wedding, and the one of those couple members of that coupleship walking her down the aisle. And that I just found very moving and very touching. So,
yeah. I think one thing I would add too is that I just loved that she, despite it all, she could have said, F this, F Christianity. This is so messed up. I hate the way that I've been treated. But she continued on in her faith and continued to see the good parts behind all of the bad things that happened to her despite that. And I think I just respected that so much because for me personally, I've had times where I've struggled with my faith in terms of these Christian people aren't acting the way that I expected them to. But in the end, like people are people and, God is God. And I really appreciated the way that she just stayed firm in her faith and still has such a strong faith in God after all of that.
It sounded like still, treating her parents with love, not retaliating or seemingly holding any sort of resentment against them, that she still holds hope that they'll come around. That's pretty beautiful.
I love that. That felt like 5 minutes. We've been going for an hour. And I'm just wondering if you guys have any final things you want to talk about, bring up, unpack, or just a final thought about something maybe that struck you or your key takeaway, maybe?
I'll jump in. I just want to add, so I have a friend in my life who recently came out and later in life. She's not old by any means because she's around my age. So obviously very young. But in your 40s, not coming out in your 20s. And although I didn't know her for that long before she came out, like what I have noticed since I met her and then she came out and to where she's at now, and I'll be excited to see where she's at 6 months from now, just being comfortable in her own skin and just aligning with who she really is. And she is also a person that, believes in something greater than her. I don't know exactly what her conception of that is, but she has a faith in in a higher power, with whatever label goes on with that. And that's what it's about. It's just finding ourselves and being comfortable in our own skin and finding healing from the pain, and this had to have been a really painful book to write. I'm sure it was very therapeutic for her, right? It couldn't have come without tears and without struggles in reliving it, and then the bravery of putting it out there. And I think of the bravery of my friend that's just, embracing who she is, even though, she's probably not doing it perfectly, because no one does anything perfectly, right? Not that I haven't had other people in my life come out, but it's just a reminder of when people find their true selves, the freedom in that, and that there should be love on both sides of that.
Absolutely. Thank you. How about you, Sarah? Anything else that you'd like to jump in and point out?
Well, when I finished the book, I was thinking about how positive her experiences in her early life were with being active in Focus on the Family. And, that may have given her a lot of the ability to write about it and to talk about it and to understand kind of how to show up and communicate in that way. So just a final thought as I finished reading.
Love it. Yeah. And I think that I want to say my favorite part when I got to the end was being inspired by her continual honesty. And, when I was growing up in the church, a lot of times it was not, you would sort of, it was like I'm going to look back and tell you how messed up I was and how great everything is now. And she said, like on page 225, she said, in all honesty, I still struggle. Some of my wounds have turned to scars, and some still need to be healed. I still dream about my family. I still have PTSD and struggle with anxiety. And so she says that. And I love that because I identify with that I'm in process. I'm not, this is a cyclical thing, right? Just living life and journeying through this. It's not a linear kind of, I'm at the end. I've reached all my goals, specifically with me in alcoholism. It's like, when I was done with the 12 steps, I was like, so what now? And they're like, guess what? Well, you get to do it over again. You get to start over. And so I'm like used to now constantly being in process and in progress. And I love that she had the courage to say that, it's not like everything's hunky dory, but, like I have, peace. And I loved that. And so with that, ladies, Boozless Babes, be kind, rewind, and thank you for the honor of your time. Take what you like and leave the rest behind.
Thank you so much for listening to Eternally Amy. Amy Liz Harrison is a best-selling author, speaker, 12-step coach, meditation teacher, and recovery advocate. To find out more, please visit amylizharrison.com. Keep up with Amy on all platforms by following @AmyLizHarrison. Please subscribe and review this podcast. It means so much to us if you do.